Um dos primeiros convidados do Tiaços foi o nosso colega Michael Vannoy Adams. Michael Vannoy Adams é psicanalista junguiano em Nova York, ele é membro da Associação Psicanalítica Junguiana e professor associado do programa de pós-doutorado na Universidade de Nova York em psicoterapia e psicanálise. Michael também é autor dos livros Pelo Amor da Imaginação, Aplicações Interdisciplinares da Psicanálise Junguiana. Ele é autor de Imaginação Multicultural, que é um livro interessantíssimo sobre a questão da raça, da cor e do inconsciente, e Princípio de Fantasia, por uma psicanálise da imaginação. Michael também escreveu Inconsciente Mitológico, talvez seu primeiro livro, e uma das referências básicas da psicologia arquetípica. A palestra que o Michael deu para nós no Tiaços foi a grande introversão viral e virtual, um exercício de psicologia arquetípica. É com muito prazer que a gente recebe Michael Vannoy Adams no nosso canal Tiaços no YouTube. Aproveitem.
Welcome. My name is Michael Vannoy Adams. I'm a Jungian psychoanalyst in New York. The video that you'll be watching is the first in a series of Zoom presentations sponsored by the Brazilian Jungian organization Thiassos during 2020-2021, the year of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm honored to have been the first Jungian psychoanalyst invited by Thiassos and its founder, my dear friend Marcus Quintes, to be a presenter in the series. The title of my Zoom presentation is The Great Introversion, Going Viral, Going Virtual. The title emphasizes the fact that during the year of the COVID-19 pandemic, people were advised to distance themselves physically and socially from other people, even at the extreme, to stay inside. Or as I prefer to say, people were advised to introvert, to turn away from external reality, to turn inward. I called this phenomenon the Great Introversion, on analogy with other historical events of enormous anomalous magnitude. For example, the Great Depression or the Great War. I also called it the Great Introversion because I imagined that people, not only introverts, but even especially extroverts, might experience the physical and social distancing not as a deprivation, but as a rare and immensely valuable opportunity, as therefore also great in that sense. The Great Introversion was my first experience with Zoom, and it was also Thiassos' first experience with Zoom. There was a glitch. The video did not begin recording at exactly the same time that I began speaking. The video as it is omits my initial remarks as well as the first images in my PowerPoint slideshow. Thankfully, Thiassos, in particular my friends Luciana Ximenez and Isa Carvalho, have made it technologically possible for me to restore the images and to reintroduce my presentation. In the video as it is, the first slide that you see, and you only glimpse it for a second, is Edvard Munch's painting, Self-Portrait After Spanish Influenza from 1919. Now you will have an opportunity to see the slides that preceded Munch's painting. The first of these slides is the image that Thiassos designed to publicize the Zoom event. The slide includes the title of my presentation in Portuguese. The color is a deep blood red. The second slide includes the title of my presentation in English, The Great Introversion, Going Viral, Going Virtual, and a photograph of a beautiful bouquet of flowers that Marcus Quintes in Sao Paulo graciously sent to me in New York the morning of the Zoom event. The third slide is Arnold Böcklin's painting, The Plague, from 1898. The image is of a skeletal grim reaper riding a grotesque monster, wielding a scythe and slaying the innocent. The fourth slide is Munch's painting, Self-Portrait After Spanish Influenza, the very first image that you see in the video as it is. As you hear me say these words, this is really nothing new. In saying this, what I meant to emphasize is that the COVID-19 pandemic is nothing new from the perspective of the history of centuries and centuries of the pervasive presence of extremely contagious, deadly diseases. Experiences like it have been the norm, not the exception. Only from the perspective of a naive progressivism is the COVID-19 pandemic a new normal. It is, in fact, the old normal. We now live in a time of privilege without precedent. It is the period of antibiotics, antivirals, and vaccinations. In comparison with all previous centuries, we have the unique opportunity to experience a happier, healthier, and very much longer life than ever before in all of human history. As a Jungian psychoanalyst, I'm a practitioner of imaginal psychology, or what I call imaginology. I emphasize the importance of images and the imagination. The premise is simple. How we imagine or reimagine any reality may radically transform and expand consciousness and make a truly decisive, creative difference in how we experience that reality. Once again, welcome to the great introversion.
Here's a little chart. It's the only chart I have, but it's a kind of comparative chart that I took off the internet. And you see a number of different highly contagious diseases there in comparison by the number of deaths in different times. The Spanish flu on the right. Measles is a tremendous killer. The Black Plague, 75 million. Anyway, it gives a kind of picture of some of the, puts things in a relative framework. I'm sure you've seen this. My understanding is that this is what was projected onto the Redeemer statue in Rio at the time of the virus. And this is what someone has done with the Statue of Liberty, you know, with a Photoshop. So even the Statue of Liberty is masked these days. So I wanted to include two images of two monuments linking our two cities together. Now we get into masks. This is the famous plague mask and an image of the famous plague doctor. And you can see the masks look as if they are modeled after Venetian or Italian masks from masked balls. Well, this is Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death. Some of you will know that short story, I assume. Poe is wonderful because he invented science fiction writing, he invented detective stories, and he invented the horror story. Nobody else invented three things like that. And The Mask of the Red Death is about a plague or a disease, a contagious disease, and the aristocrats think that they are immune from this and can have parties and a masked ball and do it all night long, and the virus will never get inside the safety of their castles. But at midnight, in Poe's short story, the Red Death comes. This is Odilon Redon's image of the Mask of the Red Death. This is from 1918. I hope that you play some baseball in Brazil. These are people wearing masks that look just exactly like our masks when in the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. So people played sports then, but they did wear the masks the way we do. This is Sarah Harper. Sarah Harper is my daughter-in-law. She's my son's wife. She finished her nursing degree last year at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And then my son and she moved to New Orleans. And she works in a hospital there. This is her intensive care unit, full protective suit. Shortly after this photograph was taken, she got the virus. She's recovered from it, and she's back at the hospital working now. But you can see that's another kind of mask that people wear. Dr. Fauci, you may know from American television. He's on the President Trump's committee that's dealing with the virus in America. And he seems to believe that nothing will ever be the same again and that we will never be able to be intimate with one another. I would love to be in Brazil. I've never been in Brazil. I've never been to Portugal. I've been to Spain, I've been to Mexico, but I've never been to Portugal and I've never been to Brazil. I look forward to coming. I look forward to shaking your hands. I will be glad to hug you. I'll be glad to kiss you. My feeling is, well, I know that I envy, being an Anglo, I envy Brazilians, that kind of Mediterranean or even Atlantic kind of feeling that you seem to be more at home with your body than some of the rest of us on the planet. And so I like the intimacy. I like the idea of Brazilian intimacy or Latin American intimacy. And so this is a slide that shows you all of the different germs that you might have on your hands when you shake hands with anyone. I hope we return to the possibility of being together in the flesh, as they say. This is by an English painter, John Martin. It's called the Seventh Plague. This is 7 out of 10 plagues that Yahweh sent on the Pharaoh in order to liberate the Hebrew people from bondage in Egypt. And so this is an English European painting from the 19th century of God sending a plague. You know, why a disease would come, you know, is an interesting question. Where they come from. Before the 20th century, we didn't have a very good idea. Now we have a better idea about these things. But we thought that it came from, there were supernatural sources, and that sometimes our own actions had something to do with, you know, it being a punishment on us. So we have a different kind of feeling about that now. This is a painting with the angel of death at a door breaking into somebody's house, and it's the plague of Rome. I believe it's supposed to be a painting of a historical event. And so I thought that was an interesting one I hadn't seen before. This is a photograph of a couple who have the bubonic plague or the Black Death. You can see that you have pustules and other kinds of sores on the body there. Those were some of the symptoms from that plague. And it looks horrific. Here I'm trying to get into Latin America and colonial and imperial questions and the conquest of the South. These are from the Spanish conquest of Mexico or Yucatan, and they show you that smallpox was one of the devastating things that killed 24 million people in about 10 years. It's one of the incredible fatality rates in history. This moves it perhaps a little bit north, I don't know, but it's another illustration from probably the 19th century from some magazine of probably smallpox among maybe North American native peoples. This is Mr. Bruegel and his famous painting, The Triumph of Death. And you see in the middle of the painting the very skinny horse, the horse of death with the skeleton, and the grim reaper with the scythe on the back of the horse, crowding everybody into hell. Well, people still needed to be reminded that it was inevitable that they would die, and that death was not just an inevitability, it was also an immediacy. This is Laurence Olivier playing in Hamlet, the movie Hamlet, the grave scene at the very end of the play where he holds the skull of his mentor or tutor, Yorick, and says, "Alas, poor Yorick." And he says something like, paint ourselves an inch thick, in other words, we can put on an inch thick of cosmetics on our face, or we could have a facelift these days. We could have plastic surgery, and in the end, we will all come to this. We will just be a skull missing some teeth. And so this was what was called at that time, of course, the memento mori. It was an image that was a reminder that we had better live our life as fast and as well as possible, because it was going to be over very soon. And this is, of course, Holbein's famous painting, The Ambassadors. And in the middle of the painting, in the front, you have this anamorphic skull, which on the right-hand side of the slide here, they've looked at it from an angle that shows you that it is a skull and not just, you know, an enigmatic something in the picture. But it's, again, another memento mori that's meant to help us understand that we ought to have a certain kind of consciousness about our mortality. Now, I'm going to try to get out of this. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and then we will come back to this at a later point. Now, how do I? Here we go. Yeah. Just go back to Zoom.
You seem to have gotten rid of the screen sharing.
Yes, and are you seeing Mike now?
Yeah, the two of you.
Yeah, where for some reason we can't seem to get it on speaker view. Okay, we got it. It's showing this.
Okay, as I said, this is going. Jung was a medical doctor. He knew about the body, but he was a psychiatrist, and he was mainly concerned about the psyche. So he wrote a number of things that he had subtitles that were called psychological commentary. I'm not really doing a psychological commentary today in my mind, as much as I'm doing a kind of psychological perspective on the current situation. There are many possible perspectives on the situation, and this is by no means the only one could have. But Jung privileges the psychic over the physical, and that's what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to begin with two Jung quotations. They're both about epidemics, and you will find that he is much more interested in and much more concerned about psychic epidemics than he is about physical epidemics. So he doesn't really have anything to say. I've gone through the collected works. He doesn't seem to have anything particular to say about real physical epidemics of diseases. He thinks that there are, I guess, psychological diseases, so to speak, that can spread rapidly among populations and can cause fatalities and casualties. So here's the first quotation. It's a certain position or prejudice on Jung's part. The gigantic catastrophes that threaten us today are not elemental happenings of a physical or biological order, but psychic events. To a quite terrifying degree, we are threatened by psychic epidemics. So he's not talking about a virus or something like that, unless we're talking about ideas or opinions or values going viral and spreading throughout a population and maybe causing catastrophe and casualties. The second quotation, I even believe that psychic disturbances are far more dangerous than epidemics. Not even the medieval epidemics of bubonic plague or smallpox killed as many people as certain differences of opinion in 1914 or certain political, and he puts this in quotation marks, certain political ideals in Russia. Now, of course, he's talking about World War I, and he's talking about the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. I've looked up the casualty rates for those things. I'll read them to you now. World War I, the estimate is 24 million deaths. The estimate for the Russian Revolution and their civil war following the revolution is 5 to 9 million deaths. World War II, 56 to 85 million deaths. And the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, as I said, 24 million deaths in about 10 years. We use these words like endemic, epidemic, pandemic. Endemic means that something is a very normal kind of occurrence in a particular location. In northeastern America, people have Lyme disease. They have that kind of problem because they have tick population there. It's endemic to that region, but it's not epidemic in America. It's not a national disease, it's a regional disease. If it were epidemic, it would be all over the country. If it were pandemic, it would be all over the world. So we have those three different ideas. And then we have the question of always, from a Jungian standpoint, what god or demon is in possession of us. We have the pandemic. I've invented the word pandemonic. We have pandemonium. That means hell is full of many, many demons. We have the word panic. And then, of course, the god behind it all is the great classical god Pan. Pan means all. So we use that in many, many words, including panic attacks. So if the god Pan is possessing us, if that demon is possessing us, if that god is possessing us, we are subject to incredible anxiety, phobia, and maybe even paranoia. Now, the title of my talk, again, is The Great Introversion, and the subtitle is Going Viral, Going Virtual. I want to address these three topics in reverse order. I'm going to first talk about going virtual, and then I'm going to be talking about going viral, and then I'm going to talk about what I'm calling the great introversion. A number of definitions. Going virtual is very simple and will be very, very quick. There are a number of definitions. Some are somewhat different from others. One definition of virtual is that something is almost but not nearly, or almost or nearly but not completely the way it's described. Another one is that it's potential but not actual. Another is that it's conceptual but not physical. One is that it's a simulation that can be similar to, or it can be different from, the experience of an event in external material social world. And then the fifth one is a group communicating together remotely by means of an online environment, which is what we're doing today. So you can say one of the definitions of going virtual is what we're doing right now. We're involved in something of a simulacrum. I mean, I assure you I'm not, a cartoon here. I'm not a caricature. This is kind of more or less what I look like in the flesh. But we're not in the same place. We're at a distance. We're remote. So we've now got these funny things: analog versus digital, concrete versus abstract, near versus far. Unamuno, the great philosopher, used the words proximal versus distal. Or distanced. Everybody wants to be up close and personal. Heinz Kohut, the psychoanalyst, talked about somebody being experience distant. This was not a good thing as far as he was concerned. He wanted people to be experience near. He would have wanted to be in a room together with all of you, rather than doing this in this way. If you privilege in-person, face-to-face relations, then at a distance relations would not be a real relation. It would be a virtual relation. So we are on Zoom today. So that's about going virtual. We are actually practicing it right now and doing it. We're experiencing virtuality. Now, are we experiencing virality? What about going viral? There are some very simple definitions and not nearly as many for virtual. One is to spread rapidly far and wide. Now, I'm not talking about the literal virus now. I'm talking about a figure of speech. I'm talking a way of phrasing that we have these days, now that we're in this electronic media. To spread rapidly far and wide. It's taken from a virus because the idea of the virus could spread very fast and be worldwide or go everywhere almost. It wouldn't be contained. So that's one definition. Another one is for anyone to produce content that is shared rapidly, perhaps even exponentially, on the internet, and that may insidiously infect computer systems. So, you know, we have Trojan horses, we have viruses in that way. It doesn't mean that these are going to be terrible things infecting our computer system, but that's one of the possibilities. That's how we started talking about viruses in the computer or online media in the first place. In the old days, again, we had the idea that there were invisible entities that caused things in the ancient world. And these things were spirits or gods and goddesses or demons, and they could get in us some way, and they could cause havoc, and they could kill us. We could invoke a demon and send it into our next door neighbor. We could do all of these kinds of things with what are now called superstitions or magic or something of that sort. That was the old way. So there were demons instead of germs. Germs can be bacteria or they can be viruses. So you had one theory, the demonic, supplanted and transcended by another 20th century scientific theory, that's the bacterial or viral. The invisible entities are too small to see with the naked eye. So people attributed supernatural or metaphysical or extrasensory powers to them, that these things were in some other invisible dimension but could enter into our dimension. That's what they call divine or demonic intervention. They could come into our space and then they could affect us in various ways, including infect us. So they were too small. Only with the technology of magnification and microscopes did we get Louis Pasteur and the germ theory of disease. And now we have a definition of a germ. It's a microscopic organism or substance. It doesn't have to be a living organism. It can be a substance, especially a bacterium or a virus, that causes disease. That's a germ. And we don't think demons cause these things now. We don't think God causes these things. We don't think the devil causes these things. And we don't think our presidents cause these things. We know that germs cause these things, and then we try to do something about them, you know, including think about them, feel about them, and do something about them. So a bacterium is a microscopic organism. It is a living thing of only one cell with no nucleus, and that reproduces by fission or by spores, and in some cases causes disease. So bacteria do not always cause disease, but some do. And we have problems with that. So we have antibiotics to deal with bacteria now. A virus is a parasite. It's a parasite that requires a host in order to reproduce. It is not a living organism. It's a non-living molecule that requires a living cell in order to reproduce. It can't reproduce on its own by fission or by spores. It needs to have some other kind of thing that it exploits in order to reproduce. So that's what we're experiencing right now. A virus is a parasite. So a virus forces a cell rapidly to reproduce thousands of identical copies. The history of this is that only in 1931 was the electron microscope invented, and it was only in 1939 that we had the first visual images of a virus. We could not see a virus before 1939. That is not very long ago. What, 80 years, 90 years, something like this? At the beginning of the 20th century, we We had no anesthetics, we had no painkillers, and we had no antibiotics, and we had no antivirals. These are all extremely recent. When I went back and began to look at this, I was shocked actually to see how really, really very recent it is in our history. So it's almost just within my own lifetime. I'm 72 years old now, and some of this is really, really within my lifetime. For example, it was 1928 when penicillin was discovered, and it was discovered only by accident. The man who discovered it, Sir Alexander Fleming, said, sometimes one finds what one is not looking for. It was only in the 1940s during World War II that penicillin was put into production and mass produced. And it was only in the last year of the war or after the war that it became first available in the United States in pharmacies by prescription. I was born in 1947. So I'm the beneficiary of living in a period, the first period in human history, when we've had antibiotics. And I'm also a beneficiary of living in the first period of human history when we've had antiviral medication. The first one was discovered in 1959 and was put into production later than that in the 1960s. So our period here, you know, if we're talking about what the new normal is, the normal is actually what was the case, say, 75 years ago, when we really didn't have a lot of vaccines, and when we didn't have antibiotics, and we didn't have antiviral medications. So I'm just going to quickly run down a list of the vaccines that we now have available for all of the diseases. Think of the world we're living in now, where everybody is focused on one virus, the COVID-19 virus, okay? But not so long ago, certainly within my lifetime, everybody had to worry all the time about many, many different viruses and many, many different bacteria every year, all the time. It wasn't just one thing that was very contagious and very fatal. It was many, many, many things that caused very serious consequences. The first vaccine was in 1796, and that was smallpox. It was not till almost 100 years later, in 1884, that we got a cholera vaccine. Then the next was rabies, then tetanus, then typhoid, 1897, the bubonic plague, 1921, tuberculosis. James Hillman, when he was diagnosed in his 80s with cancer in one of his lungs, I was told that it was at the same spot where he had had tuberculosis as a young man, as if the cancer had sought out a spot of particular weakness in his body that he had had a hard time with at some younger time. My father had tuberculosis around 1917, 1918. He had to go to West Texas and live in a sanatorium. So the next thing is 1923, and that's diphtheria. You see, I'm wearing a little button here on my coat today, okay? Now, I never met this person. It's a family heirloom in a way. It's something that my grandparents made around 1906 when my grandmother's only daughter, she had 4 boys and 1 girl, her only daughter, Bessie, Elizabeth or Bessie, died of diphtheria. That was 1906. 17 years later, they had a vaccine. She lived 17 years too early to receive the vaccine. Okay, you've got scarlet fever, whooping cough, yellow fever, influenza, encephalitis, 1952 polio. But it wasn't until 1955 that the polio vaccine in America was available. I was in first grade in 1954-55. I remember standing in line at the school, ready to get my shots, and all of the mothers there, all of the mothers were so happy. They were so happy to have a polio vaccine finally, because they now could stop worrying about where their child swam in the summer and all of these things, or whether they were going to be paralyzed like President Roosevelt. And so this is again a thing in my lifetime. Measles, mumps, and rubella were only in the 1960s and 70s. chickenpox 1974, pneumonia 1977, meningitis 1978. So, excuse me a second. Hepatitis, Lyme disease, the papilloma virus, malaria, Ebola is 2019, and we still don't have a vaccine for HIV. And so this is a very, very big project. We obviously have made tremendous progress, especially in the 20th century, and some of us are benefiting. The normal that they talk about was the normal of the last, the new normal was the norm of the last 75 years or so, is what I'm saying. That was the artificial exception to the rule. Otherwise, for all of human history, we've lived more or less with the kind of possibility of being infected the way we're all experiencing now. This is kind of a going back to the way things have always been for almost all of human history. This is the current situation isn't abnormal. What's abnormal is the last 75 years or so. My own lifetime is what's abnormal. The new normal seems to be the old normal, actually. Human longevity, the natural longevity versus artificial longevity. Evolutionary lifespan is what? It's 30 to 40 years. We would not be having dental transplants and all of these kinds of things because we would be dead at 40 and our teeth were not made to last, 80 something years, So if we were just living according to the natural situation of human beings, we would all more or less be dying in the natural world without all of this medicine and these artificial wonderful technologies we have. We would be dying at 30 or 40, about half the longevity that people experience these days. Do you know about Brazil and the United States? The reason why the lifespan was only 30 to 40 years was unhygienic conditions, contagious infections from numerous diseases, and little or no access to effective medicines. The lifespan in the United States in 1950 was 68 years. The lifespan in 2020 is 79 years. So in 70 years, the lifespan in America has been increased 11 years. In Brazil, the lifespan in 1950 was 50 years. And in 2020, it is now 76. So in 70 years, Brazilians have gained 26 years of life, in this period, basically, the 70 or 75 year period. So that we got accustomed to that. That seemed normal to us, and now suddenly we have this crisis, which is reminding us it's like a memento mori. It's reminding us of the inevitability of death and the immediacy of death. It's a kind of a wake up to a certain kind of reality. Excuse me 1 second. And now I want to talk a little bit about psychoanalysis. I want to shift here, and I want to begin to talk about the great introversion, but I want to talk about the idea of plague in psychoanalysis. It's important, plague is important in psychoanalysis in two ways. It's important historically in psychoanalysis, and it's important mythologically in psychoanalysis. It's historically important because I want to talk about when Freud and Jung came to America in 1909 to go to Clark University in Massachusetts, both of them to receive honorary doctoral degrees for their contribution to psychology. Freud was 50-something, and Jung was 30-something, but they were both going to receive honorary doctoral degrees there. Jung for the word association test, and Freud for, oddly enough, something to do with educational psychology. Now in 1954, again, when I was in first grade, Jacques Lacan traveled from Paris to Zurich to visit Jung. Can you imagine this? This was enough to get you kicked out of the Freudian movement itself to go speak to Carl Jung. But Lacan went to Zurich to talk to Jung because he wanted to talk to the oldest living people who founded the psychoanalytic movement. And according to Lacan, Jung reminisced about the voyage that he and Freud took to America in 1909. As the ship, aptly named the George Washington, sailed into New York Harbor and passed by the Statue of Liberty, Freud and Jung stood together on the deck. And Freud turned to Jung and said, "They don't realize we're bringing them the plague." So psychoanalysis in Freud's imagination was not just a cure, it was a disease. He was bringing a highly contagious, infectious disease to the rest of the world. Okay? That's how he understood it psychologically. That's the historical dimension of the plague. If we think about what we do as a kind of a thing we're spreading, you know, that might make people feel dis-ease or uneasiness, I think one could look at it that way. The plague also plays an important part in the founding myth and complex of psychoanalysis. I mean, Sophocles' play, Oedipus Rex. In Oedipus Rex, the play begins with an epidemic of famine and infertility. It's a plague that is starving and sterilizing the citizens of Thebes. The Sphinx has sent a plague onto the city because one of the citizens of the city is guilty of killing the king. No, is guilty of killing the king. And so we have to go through Tiresias the prophet and all of these. He's a sort of a psychoanalyst, right? I mean, consulted by Oedipus. And lo and behold, it turns out that Oedipus himself is the cause of the disease in this city because he has a tragic flaw. He thinks he knows better than everybody else and can interpret everything perfectly. And he is a Mr. Know-it-all. So he's very arrogant. He has the classic tragic flaw, or as the Greeks call it, hamartia, which is pride. And so, or hubris. His hamartia is hubris. And so hamartia doesn't mean the way we would think of it being maybe from Jewish, Christian, or Islamic Middle Eastern background. In that classical Greek Mediterranean way, it's an error that one makes. It's not a sin or a crime. It's not an evil thing so much as a kind of mistake one makes, you know. And so he's suffering from a mistake, and it's not a moral or legal issue. It's more of a psychological or logical issue. So now, those are the origins of the plague in Oedipus Rex. Now I want to talk a little bit about the title of this thing, The Great Introversion. Freud talks about introversion and extroversion in his volume from 1916, I believe, or thereabouts, Psychological Types. To the definition of to introvert is to turn inward. And so I'm talking about what various people call sheltering in place, or a lockdown, or staying inside, quarantining. I'm trying to talk about these kinds of things we're talking about these days as if this is an opportunity for a great introversion. Just the way people have talked about the Great Depression or the Great War, or Jung talking about the Great Mother. Okay, this is a very big thing. It's a very big collective introversion that's taking place here. And since in my understanding of introversion and extroversion, when I first began to study all that, and also the Myers-Briggs test and those things, the word was that about 75 to 80% of the population are extroverted, and about 25 to 30% of the population, 20 to 25% are introverted. So that the introverts are a distinct minority. Now, I'm a radical introvert and my wife is a radical extrovert. And so you can imagine how that works, okay? It works well sometimes, and then my wife just doesn't understand, you know, how crazy I am sometimes because, you know, I need to be by myself in a way. And I feel good being that way. Being in quarantine or being inside is not something that is very distressing to me. But to a high percentage of the population, it apparently is. And they want to get out there and mingle and be with people and be in the external material social world. Okay, so now we have this, in colloquial English, especially in Texas where I come from, if you're a cowboy, to turn in means to go to bed, to go to sleep, and to go to dream. So if you say to someone, I'm turning in, that means you're leaving their company and you're going to get in the bed. And you're going to go unconscious for 8 or 10 hours, something like that. And so you're going to engage the world of dreams and the world of imagination. You're letting go of the ego world and you're letting go of external material, social, egoistic reality. And you're going into the unconscious. You're going down, back, and in. You know, the extrovert likes to go what? Up, out, and forward. And so we have these two differences here. They're pretty big differences. I went on the internet and was shocked to see that the latest so-called research says that about 50% of the people are introverts and about 50% extroverts. Frankly, I don't believe that. I think this is a poor academic research or something like that. But they may be right and I may be wrong. My feeling is that, as with any minority group, introverts there's prejudice and bias and discrimination against introverts. I don't have a big complaint myself, but I believe it exists. In psychoanalysis, attachment theory is a very big thing. You should be attached all the time. You should have been attached to your mother when you were a child and all that. Detachment theory or separation as a Buddhist detachment kind of idea is not as popular. Attachment is, you know, a higher value in contemporary psychoanalysis, especially when you have an emphasis on interpersonal and relational psychoanalysis instead of intrapsychic or imaginal psychoanalysis. I mean, one that would really go inside, you know, not just inside a building where you are quarantined, but would go inside yourself. So there's a kind of pejorative connotation and a pathological connotation about introverts. I know that when they've had to do the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in America, there have been various fights because some of the psychiatrists have wanted to pathologize introverts and call them schizoids or even schizophrenic. And the people have had to protest against this so that introverts would not be stigmatized. So introverts are sometimes thought of as kind of autistic or as solipsistic philosophically, as detached, unrelated, dissociated, and even disembodied, as if the introverts are always walking around and having an out-of-body experience, and they're into their antisocial personality disorder. They're into some kind of avoidant behavior, and but the introverts really don't have to practice social distancing because they're quite familiar with it and they're relatively happy. Excuse me a second. I'm assuming that extroverts are going to experience the great quarantine, this coercive introversion. Nobody is really choosing this introversion. You know, they're being forced into keeping a distance from everybody else. So it's experienced by the majority as a deprivation instead of an opportunity. But I want to talk about it a little bit, not as the way the extrovert would think of it, as a loss, not a gain. But I want to talk about it as not isolation, but solitude, and not stress, but relief in a way, so that you could use this time to go within yourself. And so I have a quotation from Dr. Jung about what he calls the cave of transformation. Now you will see he really goes inside, because he's not talking about me staying in this room here for the last 2 or 3 months. I go out very occasionally, very late at night, maybe 1 or 2 a.m. to a supermarket. But other than that, I've been inside. Okay, but he's talking about going further inside into ourselves, into our own inner world, taking this as an opportunity to do that. So here's the quotation about the cave of transformation. Anyone who gets into that cave, that is to say, the cave which everyone has in himself. So he's talking about a cave inside us, a psychological or psychic cave, a cave of imagination, will find himself involved in an at first unconscious process of transformation. So if we remove ourselves from that external material social reality and we go inside and get away from all the 1,001 things that are distractions, and then if we go even deeper into ourselves, a transformational process spontaneously begins. That's what Jung is saying. We engage the dream world and we engage the world of active imagination. Now, I think what I'm going to do is just say that this is sort of like creating a sensory deprivation chamber where you remove yourself from external stimuli so that internal imagery, an autonomous process, can start up on its own, like a spontaneous generation from inside. Now, some people who are unaccustomed to this, the last thing they want to do is to introvert because it's very scary for them. They didn't know they had all of these images and things inside them. They are much more comfortable talking to somebody at a store or in a social event. You know, they don't want to be by themselves because suddenly strange things start to happen. But I'm saying if we don't want to see this as a deprivation, we can see it as an opportunity. Now I'm going to go back, I'm going to end now with, I'm going to try to pick up with the slideshow where we were before, and I'm going to close with that just by giving some more images here. Share screen? No, I'm fine. All right, here we are. These are images of Freud and Jung. I've cropped them so that you actually see the difference in Freud and Jung physically. I don't mean their ages so much, but their stature. Freud is my height. I'm 5'7". Freud was 5'7". Jung was, I don't know, 6'2" or 6'3", something like that. He was much taller than everybody else everywhere at that time. And so usually Freud, because of his reputation, fame, and all of this sort of thing, is at least put on a level with Jung, or he's made in movies and things to be a taller and bigger man than Jung. But actually the case is quite different. But here they are arriving in America. This is what they looked like at the time that Freud turned to Jung and said, they don't know that we're bringing them the plague.
Michael, you turn off your microphone.
You hear me now? Okay. All right.
Yeah, now it's okay. Thank you.
Okay, here's Ingres's painting of Oedipus and the Sphinx. And this is I'm trying to, there are no real paintings of the plague in Thebes. You know, I invite any artists out there to do a new painting of the plague in Thebes. We need one. Okay, but here's what I've got. Oedipus, he's trying to answer the riddle of the Sphinx in this picture. Now I need to be able to, you know, I'm having a problem getting this slide to function. Okay, okay, all right. This is another a wonderful painting. It's Oedipus Blinded, you see, there he is in front. You see the people of Thebes chasing him out of town. They're exiling him. But you also see some people in the foreground and on the side. It looks to me as if these are people probably suffering from the plague, especially the man on the far left there. It looks as if they are sick people. So they're expelling the man, the guilty man, from the city who has caused the sickness. And presumably, once he's out of town, then people will recover. Now, I'm going to be talking about various caves of transformation. This is the Oracle of Delphi, a picture of the Oracle, sitting on her three-legged stool. Here's a wonderful painting sitting on her three-legged stool. You can look at how she's in a trance with her eyes. It's not exactly a cave. It's some kind of room, a special room where people come, and there's an altar, and there are murals on the wall and things of that sort. Some kind of temple of Apollo, I suppose. This is another one. This is an all-women's consultation of the Oracle. This is the Oracle of Delphi, and 6 or 7 women in consultation. This is to go inside, to go into the darkness, to cover your head, to bow your head, to kneel, to do all of these kinds of things. The furniture is carpets that you kneel on. You introvert by looking down and trying to exclude the external stimuli. This is the actual literal, supposedly, cave of the Prophet Muhammad in Arabia. This is the cave of Hira. These are pilgrims, maybe at the Hajj. They're wanting to go inside the cave and see what it was like when Muhammad had his revelation. I'm talking about people going into some kind of interior space. It can be a physical space, going inside, and then going inside themselves once they're inside that space. This is a Persian a miniature illustration of the Prophet masked to prevent idolatry in the cave in the mountain. The next one is an image of the angel Jibril or Gabriel with the Prophet telling him to go recite the Quran. And this is supposed to be taking place within the cave. When you get into the cave, you begin to see things. You begin to hear things. And you begin to wonder whether they are valid or not. When Muhammad came down from the mountain after he had this experience, when he had this visionary experience, or this imaginal experience, he was very disturbed. He didn't know how to value it. And he said to his wife, Khadija, he said, am I psychotic? Am I poetic? Or am I prophetic? I call it the 3 Ps. Okay? Am I crazy? Am I just an artist? Or am I somebody bringing a revelation? Am I the messenger? And she said, well, honey, you're of course not crazy. You're not psychotic. The reason psychotic would mean you're just making it all up and it's a pathological condition. You're hallucinating, or you're deluded or hallucinating. And she said, no, that's not what's happening. This is an authentic experience. Nor are you a mere poet, because a poet isn't hallucinating or deluded, but a poet is fictionalizing things. And she's saying, you're not making this up. This is not creative writing here that you are doing. You are receiving this from an authentic source. These are coming from God, so you are the prophet. That's a good wife to have supporting her husband. Okay, and so not delusion or hallucination, not fiction, but true revelation. This is another extremely beautiful Persian illustration of the Seven Seepers, which is it's an appropriation of a Christian myth or story But it's what the American story of Rip Van Winkle is based on, where you would go into a kind of hibernation and then you would wake up years later and something would have happened. You see the dog is down there. The dog is sort of outside the cave, but you have the seven sleepers in there meditating. They really introverted. Here's William Blake, and you see Job and his family are down below in the cave. Job, of course, is being punished with boils. He's a plague or a disease, an infectious disease is being sent to him by God and Satan, who have a little bet going on. They're gambling, or they're having a wager about Job and whether Job will blame God for his afflictions. And Job is puzzled why this is happening. But here's another cave. You would enter into this thing, and God and the angels are above in some other dimension. This is a real cave, the Cave of the Apocalypse. It's where St. John is supposed to have received the book of Revelation. It's on Patmos, and it's quite an impressive space. You can see the way it's been carved out of the natural rock, and has icons all around. And so, but you can imagine going in there and lowering your head, I don't know, maybe closing the door, being in darkness and waiting to see what might emerge. This is from Myanmar. It's a Buddhist cave there. You see a mother and daughter strolling by on one side. It's spectacular, it seems to me. Who wouldn't have visions entering a space such as that? Whose imagination wouldn't be activated by this? This is the caves of Elephanta. I've been to these outside Mumbai or Bombay. They are many rooms. This is the Trimurti. This is the Shiva with three faces, the creator, the destroyer, and the preserver. You know, it's not Brahma, Vishnu, and Krishna and Shiva here. It's the three faces of Shiva. It's a trinity, like the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, except this is a Hindu kind of version of that. So the Portuguese, if I may say so, they entered the caves of Elephanta and took sledgehammers. They had a little bit to drink, as well as good Portuguese sailors would in India. And so they considered these idols, heathen idols, pagan idols. And so they broke a lot of them. But many of them do survive intact. Well, I call this the Cave of Freud. This is from 1939. Can you imagine doing analysis in this room? There's so many images there. It's so rich. It's so crowded. It's an amazing kind of scene to think about. Now, I don't have a couch. I work in chairs in my space, but I do have a couch. It, in fact, is a photograph. This is an Edmund Engelmann photograph from 1939, right before Freud got out of Vienna to escape the Nazis. Okay, this is one of the last photographs taken of their house in Vienna, as it really was at the time. And I have a copy of this on the wall of my office, so I do have a couch in my office. It's just not one you can lie on. Well, this is the Cave of Freud in London now. I hope some of you have been there. I've been there a number of times. I never lay on the couch. I had an opportunity once because I was at a meeting there where we were having dinner in the Freud Museum, if you can believe that. That was quite special. I could have sneaked in the other room and stretched out and seen if anything happened. But you see, there's a lot of stuff in this room, but it's a bigger and more spacious kind of space. But you certainly could, go within yourself. That's why Freud has his chair facing one way and the sofa or the couch facing another way. He did not want to look at the client, and he didn't want the client to look at him. This is my very dear friend. He's one of the few African-American psychoanalysts, certainly in New York, and certainly in America, and certainly in the world. This is his office in Manhattan. He's in a book called 50 Shrinks, I think, which is done by a photographer of analyst offices. So this is my dear friend Kirkland in his space, in his cave. This is an image of a quarantine. I looked on the internet, and almost all of the images of people inside are of women. I don't know what this means. It may mean that people imagine that women suffer more by being inside, by being confined. I don't know. I just see that the vast majority of images are of women. You know, it's not of a man, you know, crying at the window. Well, here's one image. I thought it was very nice looking out. It doesn't show her face, so we don't know whether she's distressed or whether she's just interested or exactly what. But now this is the New Yorker, the cover of the New Yorker magazine that just came yesterday. I got it in the mail yesterday morning, so I went on the internet and got this. This is by a famous cartoonist of the New Yorker, Roz Chast, and she has named this embroidery piece Lockdown Sampler. You see, the language that is used also influences the way we imagine things. If you call it a lockdown, then you feel oppressed and confined. If you call it sheltering, you know, you may have a more optimistic and a positive attitude toward what you're doing. She's calling it Lockdown Sampler, and I must say this woman looking out the window looks a little bit psychotic to me. It looks as if she might need to take some medication. I'm not sure, but she's a little bit wild-eyed there. It looks as if she'd like to come out. Now the final slide, the cave of James Hillman, whom Marcus and I loved dearly and miss dearly since his passing in October of 2011, now almost 10 years ago. This is James in New York, lying on a couch. And I think I'm going to end with that as a lovely possibility for all of us. So thank you very much. Okay, so Una, I want to do, I'm out of screen share now. All right, so do we want to go to the gallery thing or?
Isa, tá ouvindo? Tá. Vou dizer para ele, então, que a gente vai abrir para perguntas agora, tá bom? Você diz para ele? Tá, deixa eu só... Ó, a gente agradece a palestra e que, Michael, excelente palestra, várias perspectivas, várias possibilidades de imaginar a praga de um modo diferente. A gente vai abrir agora para perguntas, para as pessoas poderem aproveitar esse espaço, ok? Vamos começar? Quem gostaria de fazer uma pergunta?
Bom, eu pensei numa pergunta aqui.
Quem está falando?
A Daniela Lascani. Hi, Michael. Thank you very much. Eu pensei, quando você estava falando sobre a questão dos vírus na atualidade, comparando com a nossa condição de privilegiados, por a gente já ter nascido em épocas de antibióticos e vacinas, eu fiquei pensando quais seriam as novas imagens que você imagina ou pensa que virão a partir do discurso científico que outros vírus desconhecidos e milhões que podem estar congelados, que o ser humano nunca teve acesso e que a gente nem sabe quais são, nesse futuro próximo. Que perigos são esses que estão aí e que imagens que podem emergir daí?
Well, I'm not someone who imagines that he is a prophet. Jung said, I'm like Jung, he said, I'm not a prophet. When he talked about what he called the prospective function, when he was talking about a kind of future orientation and not like Freud always looking back to the past, he said it was just an approximation, a calculation of probabilities about the future like a weather forecast. It was not a hard and fast prediction or a revelation that would lead to a prophecy that was bound to be fulfilled. So I certainly don't claim any more insight into this than anybody who is sharing this Zoom meeting today. I certainly don't know the answer to that. What I'm really trying to say is that there is a large unknown there. We have, with our educational systems, with psychoanalysis, there's an effort here with all of our yogas, our systems of enlightenment, all of these meditation things. There are many, many systems that are trying to, that are available to us to try to give us ways to become more conscious or to become more enlightened. All right, and science is one of them. The experimental method is a very important way of trying to become enlightened about some things too, especially about material things. I'm not sure whether experiments in psychology are very useful, but certainly in the material sciences, yes. We found out some incredible things there. I do not think that we should look upon science as a god, as if it's going to save us, like another savior, that we're always going to find a scientific or technological fix, you know. So I wouldn't be sanguine or incredibly optimistic that in fact, I'm sure that something else will pop up tomorrow. It may not be something as serious as this or as infectious as this, but there will be some other things. And whether we have the resources and other kinds of things to both material resources and intellectual resources to discover new things that would address the emergent problems, your guess is as good as mine. I would say some yes, and a lot no, probably. And now we have so many people on the planet, never before as many people as this. Everything is much more crowded. Everybody is going places and mingling and interacting far more than any other time. So I would say just the sheer volume, the scale of interaction makes it more probable that certain kinds of things will spread, including good ideas, including values, including love, including, I don't know, all sorts of things. I wouldn't be married to my wife from India at some previous, 150 years ago. This would not have been possible, And so I'm very grateful for some of these technologies and things, but I don't see them as the cure-all or the panacea. It's not some kind of alchemical miracle that we should expect that we shouldn't get foolishly optimistic about these things. But I don't think we ought to be ridiculously pessimistic either. Everybody who is with this Middle Eastern kind of thing, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there's a tendency there to have an end of the world narrative. James Hillman talked about that. He said that Ronald Reagan, the only book Ronald Reagan read when he was president was The Late Great Planet Earth, which was about the end of time. That linear narrative of progress with a catastrophic ending, like the apocalypse or Armageddon, is just one story that's available to us. There are cyclical stories. There are all kinds of other things besides that one. It's very popular in our culture. There are a lot of people who doom and gloom. They almost sort of enjoy it. There are some people who are having a really good time these days, thinking the worst. They couldn't be happier. I know that most people are not that way, but there's certainly some people, they feel more alive than they ever have because they think they're in this terrible end of the days. It's like a Beckett play, So I don't know whether that answers your question, but I've talked too long.
It did. Thank you.
Isa, vamos fazer agora. Eu vou fazer uma pergunta, depois o Joel, depois o Gustavo Beck do México. Michael, Estava me lembrando que na década de 80, o Thomas Kirsch levantou uma grande guerra política contra o DSM-3 para evitar que o conceito de introversão fosse considerado um conceito patológico, né? Você mencionou isso, eu acho importante relembrar isso, né? De que houve um movimento político por parte dos junguianos a fim de redimir ou libertar a introversão de ser considerado um conceito patológico. E eu fico pensando o seguinte, como evitar pensar que a ideia de introversão se confunda com a ideia de narcisismo? Ou seja, se a introversão pode nos conduzir à caverna, essa caverna não está no ego. Ela está em outro lugar. Mas como é que você marcaria uma diferença entre introversão e narcisismo?
Well, I don't know what Jung would have said about, he's got introverts and extroverts, and then he's got feeling types and thinking types and sensation types and intuition types. He's got all these classifications. He likes 2s and he likes 4s. Sometimes I laugh about his mathematics. One Jungian analyst once asked me what I thought about the 4 functions. And I said, well, I don't know why imagination couldn't be in there just as well as one of these others. I don't know why it's limited to 4. I don't know why it's just these 4. So I have all sorts of questions that one might ask. I don't think that extroverts are more narcissistic than introverts, or that introverts are more narcissistic than extroverts. It's a kind of, to me, it's a kind of funny idea, a kind of amusing thing to wonder about. I can see that somebody might think that if you are doing things by yourself, as a child, I was an only child till I was 9 years old. And I wanted my parents because I was an only child and sometimes lonely. And they were much older than other men. My father was born in 1900, my mother in 1906. They were 20 or 30 years older than most other people my age, their parents. So I had a deep place in history in that way. But they weren't out there playing baseball with me and things like that. You know, they're like younger parents might do things with their children. So I was by myself a lot of the time. And I learned to be by myself. I learned to entertain myself and occupy myself and all that. I'm glad I had that experience. You know, I'm not so dependent on other people to make me feel that something is going on in my life. But I certainly don't think it's the only way to be. You know, when my brother and sister were adopted from Korea in 1957, that was a wonderful thing. But my idea was that I wanted a brother who was my age and who was kind of a twin who could pitch baseballs to me so that I could hit home runs. It was a very narcissistic idea about my, you know, having a brother. And then, you know, on top of that, my parents got a sister to come along with it too. And so I'm incredibly grateful to have had that kind of family experience. You know, when I was born, my mother was 41 or 42 years old. And in 1947, that was an unusual kind of age for women to be bearing children, you know, and they used to say that you would end up a genius or an idiot. I'll let you decide which I ended up being, okay? But, you know, I've had my own experience. I don't think confidence in oneself, being firstborn or being an only child or being an introvert is necessarily narcissistic. I'm happy for people to love themselves in a good way. I don't like people to have low self-esteem and to have no self-worth. And I'm especially distressed when I hear women, you know, talk a little bit more about those things than some men do. I'm distressed that the men seem to be thinking that they're great and they have no problem, you know. So I, you know, it's I wouldn't call their thing narcissism. It might just be arrogance. I'm not sure. The categories we have, the diagnostic categories, you know, themselves need a little bit of looking at. James, as you know, James Hillman, wrote extensively about narcissism and said that the myth of Narcissus is a much richer idea. The story is much richer than the diagnostic category in these books. You know, they just have a list of 4 things that say you're a narcissist, but if you go read about Narcissus, you know, there's a whole lot more to the story. Bion also was aware of this. There are people, psychoanalysts who are exceptional, who are a whole lot smarter than a committee of psychiatrists and social workers and psychologists who are doing the latest edition of the DSM. And we're privileged to be in a psychoanalytic community where we can meet some of these people and really get close to them and experience them. And so I'm very, very grateful for you, for James Hillman, for my colleagues like Andrea in the JPA, all of the people I've known and loved and had experiences of. So I don't think introversion is narcissism at all. I do recall, I was thinking of it the other day, that piece by Thomas Kirsch, in which he, I believe it's in a book that Andrew Samuels edited. It may be something about techniques and analytical psychology. It was by Karnak Books. I don't have it anymore. It's in the JPA library across from the Empire State Building. Okay, and Andrea has an office there, so she can walk in there and read the Thomas Kirsch thing any old day. But I remember that where he was talking about how introverts get a raw deal because it's like anybody who's a serial killer or something, the first thing they say is he didn't have many friends. You know, it's as if you aren't a social butterfly, then you're going to, I don't know, end up in the federal prison.
Obrigado, Michael. Joel?
Obrigado, Marcos. Hi, Michael. Good
Hello.
to see you. Good to see you face to face.
Thank you.
The question is, a caverna como um lugar de uma introversão forçada, ela também é um lugar de confinamento e como um lugar de confinamento, ela é um lugar de exílio também. E Pan, como você mencionou, ele é muito próximo ao culto de Dionisos, né, o culto de Dionísio. E eu fiquei pensando a respeito do lugar de Dioniso na pandemia e me lembrei do livro de Rafael Lopes Pedraza, Dionysus in Exile. E aí eu me pergunto, nós estamos com Dioniso no exílio novamente, e o diasparagmos, né, o desmembramento e o remembramento de Dionísio e a questão constitans também. Eu gostaria que você falasse um pouco mais a esse respeito. Thank you.
I'm not sure I got everything you were saying, but I think I got enough. You tell me if I understood and am answering your question reasonably well. When you were talking about exile, the image that came to my mind was of Nelson Mandela. Now, he wasn't exiled, you could say, he was in prison. Okay? Somebody like Oedipus was exiled. The ancient Hebrews had scapegoats. They would send something or somebody out into the desert. They would expel the person from the community. As I understand, in Japan and maybe in Amish communities, if you aren't with everybody, you might be shunned. It's a very hard, you're almost, everybody abandons you, nobody speaks to you, you are, you know, forced into some kind of isolation. You want to talk about social distancing, that some of that seems like an incredibly cruel and sadistic way to force somebody into some sort of isolation or solitude. So now, there are plenty of people like Nelson Mandela who've been in prison, who have used that time, I'm assuming, to meditate and to do various kinds of things, to look within themselves and whatever, maybe to write some things there, I mean, the stories, there are many, many, right? There are many, many, many. Even the Marquis de Sade, when he was locked up, he wrote some novels and things, okay? So it's not necessarily social justice issues that you might do if you're in confinement, but it might open up all kinds of creativity and other things that you haven't previously imagined. Surprising things. To me, the unconscious, the best word to talk about the unconscious is surprise. The unconscious would not be anything at all if it weren't surprising to us. Sometimes it's shocking or traumatic even. But a lot of the time, it has to be surprising at least. It has to be something, it just doesn't deserve the name unconscious, you know, if it's something the ego already knows. So whether you decide to go into seclusion yourself, you know, like a monk, to go into the desert, I mean, to go into a hole in the ground. When I went out to what is the pueblo that, Taos Pueblo in New Mexico, where Freud went. He describes the journey in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. When I went out there many years ago with my wife and son, and he was a little boy, there was a young man, he was a beautiful Native American man. He went to college. This was his summer job. He would take tourists who came to the Taos Pueblo around and show them the things and talk about life in the tribe. Okay, and he was a lovely, lovely man. He was so great. He was so handsome too, and he had his hair pulled back, and he had it tied back in a long tail behind, braided tail. And he talked about the big blue river, the big blue lake on the other side of the sacred mountain. And he was a big fan of President Nixon, because one of the things Nixon had done was to declare that lake sacred and to protect the lake. So he was very, very happy with Richard Nixon, whatever the rest of America was happy with, because he felt the president had protected this sacred place. Now, the boy told us about his initiation into manhood. These people don't just grow all their own crops and things. They're like all other Americans now. They go downtown and they go to the supermarket in their pickup truck and they buy their groceries and all that sort of thing. They don't make their own bread. They buy bleached white bread and other kinds of things that are not particularly good for your health. They buy bologna. They buy, okay, so when he was about 12 or 13 years old, when boys reach puberty, he and his little friends had to leave the mothers. They had to separate from the mothers, so they had a ritual. And so there was a big hole dug by the men in the tribe, and the little boys were given kisses and hugs by their mothers in the evening, and then they were given a lunch, something to eat. They were given little juice boxes, little cartons of juice, and they were given bologna sandwiches with mayonnaise, and probably some chips to eat. You know, a very ordinary, you know, meal these days. You know, nothing fancy or anything like that. It was not ancient Indian corn or something like that, ground on, you know, I don't know, a granite pestle, with a granite pestle. You know, they were given these things like everybody else. They were just put down in this hole. They had to spend the entire night there. It was covered up with a big sheet of tin, and they had to stay down there all in the darkness, these little boys. And then in the morning, the men of the tribe came and pulled that tin back and lifted the boys out of there and pronounced them men. They had left the mothers, they had left the womb, because the cave in that place, the cave of transformation, was obviously the womb of the mother too. And so they were coming out into their manhood in a way. Now, you may think one thing or another about that, but it seems to me exactly what Jung is talking about. You know, that's just a ritual within a certain ethnic community in New Mexico. Okay, and it's not like a bar mitzvah, you know, a bar mitzvah for Jews, or a confirmation for Catholics, or a Sweet 16 or a Sweet 16 party where people are coming of age. We have all of these things for people to help people make transitions. And so, you know, we do create spaces. the psychoanalytic office is an invention by Freud. He wasn't thinking, oh, I'm going to imitate Muhammad. He didn't say, I'm going to use these Killam carpets from Vienna instead of a Persian carpet in a mosque, but his couch is covered with carpets, if you look at it, right? And he's got you lying down. He doesn't have you kneeling and putting your head to the floor, but he's got his own furniture with his own process of helping you go within. And he's not telling you to pray to God, but he's telling you to not to censor yourself, to let whatever comes out. Says, let the voices of the unconscious speak, you know, for an hour. You can leave the office and go back outside, and you can be an extrovert and talk to everybody on the street. But when you're in here 4 days a week or 1 day a week, in here, we're creating the cave-like conditions to make the imagination process possible. And we're devoting this time and space to dreams, revelations, compensation, imagination, and all of those ideas that Jung had. And Freud started it. You know, he didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't trying to create a new religion. He was coming out of hypnosis, right? But hypnosis already was about putting people in a trance. You don't have to do ayahuasca. You don't have to do LSD. You don't have to do mushrooms. You don't have to do any of these things. You don't have to flagellate yourself, or you don't have to do Lent or Ramadan. You don't have to, you know, deprive yourself of sleep in order to make contact with the other dimension. You know, we have all sorts of sophisticated ways to get in touch with the imagination. And I'm saying that if people had a little bit different attitude and weren't feeling so sorry for themselves during this quarantine, then they could really take advantage in some sense of, you know, the opportunity to go into themselves and make contact with and have impact from the imagination. And it would have transformative effect on them. At least that's what Jung says. Thank you.
Obrigado, Joel. Já que a referência foi feita ao México, nosso amigo mexicano Gustavo Becker.
Marcus, I think I'll ask you in English because my Portuñol will only confuse everybody. So,
Okay, you speak in English and the translator.
Is that scoundrel Gustavo?
yes, Michael, how are you? Good to see you. It was
¿Cómo
very
está,
good.
amigo?
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
You're with your favorite gringo.
I am. I was just thinking, you're one of the few people that respects Lacan, Freud, Jung, and Hillman at the same time. I don't think I know anybody that does that except Marcus, perhaps. But anyway, I wanted to ask you something because so for me, one of the most important Hillman ideas by Hillman, at least in his later years, was this notion of the depth psychology of extroversion, right?
Yeah.
And he devoted a lot of energy to that. And for me, it's very important because that sort of opened the door for archetypal psychology to deal with issues of race, of race, economics, culture, whatever. So I was wondering if you could maybe just speculate a little bit regarding how your notion of great introversion could intersect with that. If we could be extroverted within this great introversion, so to speak.
Okay, that's a very interesting and important question as far as I'm concerned, and it's a question that I think about often. You know, not every day, but I think about it. I especially think about it because in America now, and I'm assuming in other parts of the world too, it's not just confined here. It's like another thing that's spread rapidly around the globe. We seem to be in a phase of activism and moralism, I would say. The social justice movement, for example, would be an example of combining a moral kind of perspective with an activist perspective. And, you know, some of my dear Jungian friends are very well known for having articulated a position over several years in this way. My first book, The Multicultural Imagination, Race, Color, and the Unconscious, I was actually on Zoom once, and that was 2 days ago, for a class of 6 students who were in psychoanalytic training at an institute in Manhattan. I said to them that, you know, if they were to go back and look at my book, which was written 25 years ago, I mean, it's a quarter century old. I mean, I really do feel as if I'm on the way out. And, you know, it's not everybody has read that book. I'm proud of that book, but it's not a book that is urging everybody to get into the streets and take action. It's a work of analysis. It's not, I'm not an activist. I'm not a moralist. I am an analyst. That's what I try to do well. And if other people want to do this or that with some of the ideas I'm talking about, that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's their business and their choice. Just as I would never presume to try to introduce a political or social or other consideration in an analytic session. You know, I'm very classically Freudian that way. I don't believe this should be an active and directive kind of therapy. I want to see what is going to happen out of the person's imagination on its own. And then they can take me or leave me. I'm not there to give them wisdom or a way of life. What do I know? You remember that story Jung tells about going to India to receive his 3 honorary doctorates? And he saw a guru there and he was so impressed. There were vast crowds and things like that. And then Jung said, and then I talked to his wife. You know, his wife knew, you know, everything about the guy and, you know, behind doors and all that, and knew that he was not some great saint and pure man and, I don't know, a God, a walking God. And so, you know, James made a move, and he made it before Andrew Samuels did. Andrew doesn't particularly, hasn't always been pleased for me to say that, but James was actually ahead of Andrew in trying to talk about soul in the world. He was doing it from a more mythological perspective than Andrew is. You know, Andrew comes out of the British Jungian group, the classic one with Fordham, the object relations, and as he calls it, developmental psychology group. So they're much more extroverted and much more interpersonal and much more, they're less intrapsychic, less mythological than, say, the Association of Jungian Analysts in London, the old Gerhard Adler group and all that. I mean, there are these differences in people's trainings, and people who go to one institute rather than another, they self-select into those things in a way. Their own personality is set up in that way. So now, I don't want to, I'm not interested in ego psychology. I don't want to kill the ego. I want the ego right there. But as James said, the ego is always wrong. Now, he was exaggerating the way James liked to, but I'm kind of more with that than, you know, thinking it's sometimes right. You know, it has to prove itself to me, because it looks to me as if it's just trying to preserve the status quo and be defensive. You know, it doesn't want any input from anything else. And so if you're so quick to be active and directive and out in the street and engaged with external reality and all of that, and trying to, I don't know, have petition drives, whether it's with Parliament or whether it's with the International Association of Jungian Psychologists, that's not my starting place.
Sure.
Okay, if Andrew or somebody else wants to do that kind of thing, then that's okay with me. I'm not going to get out there and oppose them and this. It would take some very weird thing for me to get out there and fight somebody over their expressing their sincere opinion about something. I'm more just quiescent and thoughtful about things. It has to do with my personality. You know, when I was younger, when I was in my 20s and in college and all that sort of thing, you know, I was a kind of political activist. I was the editor of the the college newspaper. I was the editor of the yearbook. I was doing civil rights stuff, Vietnam protests. I was writing for kind of radical newspapers. I was an intern on the Washington Post the summer of 1968. I drove a car all night long as an intern reporter on a Washington Post car through the burned out sections of the black neighborhood after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And then Robert Kennedy was also assassinated, you know, shortly around that time. And then Eugene McCarthy challenged Lyndon Johnson, you know, who's from my state, from Texas and all of that thing. You know, I met Lyndon Johnson many years later at a birthday party one of my professors had for him, and I met Lady Bird Johnson. They were absolutely wonderful people, Lady Bird especially. They didn't think that they were better than everybody else or anything like that. Shortly after that, Johnson died because, you know, leaving Washington and stop being the leader of the free world, and then going back to the ranch. Well, he had a heart condition. He had one all those years, and he started smoking again. And so he basically died of a heart attack because he, I guess, was depressed, not being, you know, so active in that place. He had accomplished great things, but then he was depressed because of Vietnam. He had passed all the civil rights legislation and all of those great things, but lots of people hated him. LBJ, how many babies have you burned today? All of these things. We think that, you know, people hate political leaders and all that sort of thing more today, but in fact, if you go back and look carefully at things, there's been a whole lot of hatred and and partisanship out there, and not a whole lot of kind of conversation or dialogue. To have dialogue and negotiation with the other, Jung says, you know, is extremely important. James wanted to not just he got to a point in his life, he was getting older, and he quit being an analyst, as you know, and he wrote that book, We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy, and the World's Getting Worse. He co-authored that book. And a lot of Jungians in America hated him for it, partly because they thought that he was going to ruin their practice and they were going to lose money. It would be bad for business. But some of them just hated it too because they didn't agree with him. And they thought he was being a smartass again. You know, James was a kind of provocateur. He was different. He was not complacent. He was not a worshiper of the religion of Carl Jung. You know, and that's all of the things that I admired about him. So for him to be talking about how you could bring soul into the world, I was always interested in having conversations with him about that. Andrew's approach to politics, the political psyche and politics in the world, seems to me to be more conventional in its approach. I'm not sure why we need Jungian analysis or the unconscious or anything to be advocating or trying to implement a number of the ideas and values that Andrew has articulated. You see, I don't find them particularly unusual. I might agree with some of them or disagree with some others, you know, but with James, I was always, there was a great deal of imagination in James. You know, to be in his presence or to read his works, for me, was the experience of, you know, something new opening up that I was then compelled to wrestle with. He was like that kind of angel in the Bible that you have to wrestle with, and you may get your butt thrown out of joint, you know, in the process. And I admired that and was immensely grateful for it. That would be my part of my eulogy for James. You know, I dedicated my last book, For Love of the Imagination, in loving memory of James. And I've written some articles about that. If you wanted to know what I really think about all that in a good way, you probably read it already, but I believe it's in the fantasy principle. I know it is. It's the chapter on James in that particular book, where I talk about working in East New York with these Latino and African-American boys and their neighborhood. It's the most violent neighborhood in New York City. They did not want to send any social work interns from NYU out there who weren't men, because they were afraid that there would be too much violence and some girl at NYU might get hurt. So they sent me out there the first year because I was older and a man, and they sent me into that territory. That's how I know Kirkland Vaughn's, the analyst I showed you his cave. He ran that clinic there. And believe you me, people were getting killed all the time and all that sort of stuff. Women were there overwhelmingly. They didn't have men in the marriage or in the house and stuff. The men were on the street. There was a whole lot of drug activity, a lot of violence. They were bringing themselves in there to try to have psychoanalytic therapy, and they were bringing their children in. And so I was privileged to be in that thing. But I was doing all sorts of imaginative techniques that I talk about in that chapter that were very puzzling to Kirkland and other people who weren't Jungians. I was reading these children's stories. I was reading to them the Odyssey that was in a little children's version. We talked about Homer in the Odyssey and Homer Simpson. We did all sorts of things together, me and these little boys. It was just a little group of boys. And, you know, most of them had either abusive or fathers who'd abandoned them or abused them or something like that. And there I was trying to read them these multicultural books that I went to a multicultural bookstore and bought. The other people weren't even thinking like this, but it was only because I'm a Jungian or because I'm interested in the imagination that I was even trying something like that. But they did not need to live in an extroverted world out there because, as I said, people are shooting up drugs, they're shooting people down, and they're shooting off sexually. Okay, they do not need to be overly engaged in external material social reality. They need a quiet place where those little boys can come and be in a world of imagination and get out of. I had a young black girl who was about 15 or 16. All she wanted to do, she was in a homeless shelter with her mother. And she was susceptible to drugs and men hitting on her and all this sort of thing. And, you know, she loved me in a weird way, you know, because I knew about fairy tales and all this sort of thing. She wanted every session we had to be about some kind of fairy tale. Well, this was very unconventional therapy or analysis according to non-Jungians. But we could do that kind of work together. And, you know, it was good for her soul and heart, I have to say. Now, was that working in the external world? Yes, in a way. But it was also realizing that people who are really out there in that world, you know, they don't have any time to be off by themselves and to let their imagination go and things like that. This is an incredibly valuable thing to provide some space of introversion for some of these people in these terrible circumstances, it seems to me. So that, you know, you can read all about it in that chapter, and, you know, I feel very strongly about that. You know, I do care, and, you know, but I think the imagination is a wonderful, wonderful, valuable tool, if I can say that, in any of these things. It's some way more profound than marching in a march and carrying a sign. In my way of thinking of it, it's a more radical and original kind of process.
Thanks.
I've got a photograph of you and James together at Pittsburgh, and you need to email me so that I can send that to you.
I'll email you. Thank you. I appreciate your answer. It was really helpful.
Gustavo, grande abraço, amigo. Antonieta, última pergunta, tá bom?
Okay. Thank you, Michael, for your conference. So my question is, you said about the great introversion that it's I'm sorry. Did you listen from the beginning?
Pardon me. What about the great introversion?
Yeah. So you said the great introversion is a cultural kind of a pandemic movement of being inside. Yeah. Ecologists they say that with the things that is happening in the world, like Venezia's channels being cleaner and the big cities' skies being cleaner. It's not necessarily a good thing, because when we finish it, when we finish the isolation, people will try to compensate this moment and produce more and consume more. So we need to maybe rethink our habits of production and consumption, consuming. And about this psych, if we think this great introversion as a chance to rethink about ourselves and change as a society, we could say that this could be an opportunity to clean our relations and the way we are as a society to each other. Do you believe it is possible, or maybe it's more than possible, or a real movement, or a valid movement to humanity? That's my question.
Well, that's a good question, I guess, for us to end on. It's a very important question. Even though the quarantine and the introversion and the virus and all of that may have prompted you to ask the question yourself, the question exists whether we have a virus or not. The question was there before all of this started, and it will be there after people have a vaccine, where they've got some other way of adapting to the current situation. One could say that there are more important, from certain perspectives, there are more important questions to be talked about than the virus right now. You could say, why have we stopped talking about global warming? You see the media in New York, we have the mayor on every day, we have the governor on every day, they're on 24 hours a day, they're repeating themselves incessantly from day to day. I mean, if they have something to say, then, you know, let them come on. But if it's just some, I don't know, it begins to get, it begins to lose its impact or its effect, it seems to me. And so I would like to say that there might be somebody out there who is, it could be anything from preserving religion in a time like this, to preserving the planet, to trying to make sure that what you idiots call football continues to exist, okay? Because our football is going to go on forever, okay? I'm just teasing you, but I'm saying, you know, people have various values, and a lot of these things are important. Certainly, my wife is in, she has a project called Dear Climate. You can Google it and see what she's involved in, all of their projects. It's an artistic and academic collective, and you can write messages to the climate. You can talk to the climate. It's all about global warming and other kinds of things like that. So she's very actively involved in these things. I do something else with my time. I can't do everything. You know, you're seeing me do sort of what I do today, and I hope it has some value for some people. I know it's not what everybody loves, and I like your dog. What kind of dog do you have there?
It's, I don't know how to say it in English, but
okay, I see now. Okay,
yeah, it's a very happy dog.
Now, you've all intimidated my cat, or else it would be out here. You know, I've got a very handsome, manly cat. He's pretty old now, but you know, he's hanging in there. Well, cats, of course, are my preference because they're so introverted, and I can see that you're an extrovert because you've got that dog that just cannot stand not to lick you.
Yeah.
That dog is not going into quarantine anytime soon, and I see it's not wearing a mask. Put a mask on that dog, okay? I'm going to get my cat a mask now that I'm thinking of this. There are a lot of things we could take about, and the media. You know, I thought I was going to be a journalist. I thought I was going to be an opinion writer for the New York Times and all of these things when I was about 20 or 21. That was my ambition. And then I realized the reason I quit trying to be a journalist and decided to go in another direction, part of that was because when I worked on the Washington Post and I worked on the Atlanta Constitution and I saw these things up close, then I saw that these are really businesses. They are just as capitalist as any other kind of thing, especially these days. All of these media outlets have bases, just the way your president and my president have their bases that they appeal to. The media have these bases as well. I think you know, maybe that was mentioned a little bit earlier by Gustavo, I'm not sure, but these things, they run certain kinds of stories if it sells their product. You know, they have a branding thing. They know, they do market research. They know exactly that most of their readers are women from 30 to 40 with a college degree or some other thing like that. They figured all of that out in minute detail, and they're not going to include stories anymore in the newspaper that are going to annoy these people and cause them to write letters or get on the internet or something like that. They are in a, we're all in a time where this is a bit risky, you know. Anybody can accuse anybody of anything. Anybody can attack anybody of anything on the internet and all this stuff, you know. People should be, I think everybody needs to be a little bit cautious and go a little bit slow these days and reflect a little bit more than before, because, you know, suddenly almost anything could happen. I'm not counseling you being paranoid or anything like that. I'm just saying there are a lot of important issues. Global warming is one, poverty is another, sexual harassment is another. You know, there's so many different things that are important. And what gets highlighted or featured, or whether they all get equal time, you know, is a very interesting question. Something like this moment can crowd out a lot of very important things that are legitimate. And I think it's incumbent on us to be aware of that and to try our best to, you know, keep those things in mind, even if they're not front and center, you know, and also just to notice how biased a lot of the media is in propagandizing some point they have. You know, they really, I mean, it is very different from when I started out in it, I do believe. I believe the Atlanta had 2 big newspapers. Now they just have 1, and it's not so big, and it's more or less electronic. You know, the media landscape has changed dramatically. And now we've got all this fuss about Twitter and social, you know, media and other kinds of stuff, and whether they're going to censor things or exactly what's going to happen with all that. These are very big issues. Overpopulation is an issue as far as I'm concerned. You know, if people were not so crowded together and all that sort of stuff. And also then there are also weird habits people have. You know, I mean, eating habits and other kinds of things. There are ways that you can be very risky. The AIDS thing, I mean, my dear drummer in my rock and roll band when I was in high school was Mikhail Baryshnikov's accompanist in New York. He was his pianist for his ballet. You know, and I saw him after I moved to New York in 1986. I invited Lynn Stanford over and we had a conversation and all that. And, you know, he told me that he was HIV positive. I mean, back then you didn't even say that. You just said you have AIDS. Well, I was shocked. I knew he was gay and all that sort of thing. He was out. I'd known he was gay since we were kids together. There wasn't any doubt about it. His father was a football coach. His father was kind of macho, but you know, his father was very nice to Lynn. His father didn't mistreat his son or anything like that or make him feel bad about himself. But Lynn, you know, got that virus, you know, by doing something we all presumably enjoy doing some of the time. Okay, and it wasn't because he was a homosexual and he committed a sin that was against the Bible, or it's like, again, why am I, it's like Job's question, why have I got this? You know, why have I got this? And what am I going to do about it? Do I have myself to blame, God to blame, the government to blame, or exactly what? And what I always rely on and come back to is the question that I was raising earlier about when we were talking about political action and things. I'm not interested, I'm interested in what could real psychoanalytic work contribute to any of these questions. I don't want to just hear somebody say, who happens to be a psychoanalyst, say, I want to vote for so-and-so. If they've gone in and listened to their dreams and done active imagination and a whole lot of other things that they ought to be doing, and then maybe some surprising thought has come to them about who they should vote for, then I'll be impressed. But if they're just like everybody else who has nothing to do with psychoanalysis and they have very ordinary political opinions, then, you know, I'm not going to listen very carefully to what they have to say any more than I would just to every other person I know. So I don't know. I hope that's not too pessimistic a note to end on. I think there's the psychoanalysis offers us an opportunity to be more creative about these things than if we were just using our ego or our super ego to lead campaigns for the right. Okay, and when we get involved in those campaigns too, sometimes we can get self-righteous and we can think we know the truth and nobody else does, and that we are the moral ones. And so there's a shadow side to all of that as well that we need to be careful about. So do you think we should end it there? And then I can go try to get my wife to Zoom me up to one of these happy hours she keeps talking about. I have got some tequila. I'm sorry I can't share my limes and you know, other things with you. Gustavo could enjoy that. I think we could do that.
Sure.
A margarita or two. My wife knows how to get a lot of salt on the rim. You know, I'm not so good at that, but I like to make pictures of margaritas now. I say, why just do a shaker? Why not do a considerable amount of margarita that you can just have fun pouring, you know, at any moment. So if you want to come to New York and hang out with me, then I'll get you a glass and we can hang out. And until then, adios.
Michael, queria te agradecer pela oportunidade excepcional que você nos deu, pelo teu carinho, pela tua generosidade, pela tua disponibilidade em poder estar com a gente aqui 2 horas. Nós tivemos 215 pessoas te ouvindo, gente do Brasil, gente que está na França, gente que está no México, pessoas que estão no Uruguai. Uma oportunidade bastante peculiar da gente estabelecer uma relação tão íntima, tão próxima e tão afetuosa com você. Para mim, que te leio há 25 anos e que continua sendo uma referência teórica, profissional, de amizade, eu estou felicíssimo. Muito obrigado pelo teu carinho, pela tua presença. Eu espero que a gente possa fazer isso novamente e fiquei com ciúmes do Gustavo. Espero também poder te visitar novamente em Nova York. Tá bom?
Okay. Thank you for those kind and loving words. Bye-bye. Hasta la vista.